Everyone. Thank you for joining us for our Coexistence in Practice series. I request Samira to introduce Coexistence Consortium and the speaker, Amrita Neelakantan.
Thank you, Anjali. And thank you to everyone for joining today's webinar. The Coexistence Consortium is a network of conservation researchers and practitioners from diverse disciplines united by a common vision to understand the intricate and complex dynamics of coexistence between humans and wildlife. Our mission extends beyond the concept of conserving animals in far-off protected areas or distant forest pockets. We also emphasize the importance of living well with nature, even in our own immediate surroundings. Our long-term goal is to employ an experimental and evidence-based approach to catalyze a variety of context-specific human-wildlife coexistence projects around the world. And I'm really delighted to introduce our speaker today. Dr. Amrita Neelakantan is a conservation scientist with 11 years of engagement in Central India. She holds a doctorate from Columbia University for her thesis on resettled households around Kanha Tiger Reserve. She's the executive director of the Network for Conserving Central India, NCCI, and a member of the working group of the Coexistence Consortium. She has conducted field research in the cloud forests of the Ecuadorian Andes, the coastal forests of Kenya, and a year-long stint in the northern dry deciduous forests of Madagascar. Over to you, Amrita.
Thanks, Amira. And thanks everyone for joining us today. I'm very happy to be here and be able to speak to you about where I've worked for the last decade or a bit more in Central India. A lot of this talk is going to be centered around Kanha, where I spend a lot of my time still. And some of it is going to be across Central India. I'm going to jump into this, and those of you who came to the Science Gallery talk on the same themes might find a few similarities, but I hope to spark slightly different discussions with slightly different results and stories. This panel artwork here is by Sudarshan Shaw, an artist and collaborator on one of the main projects from the NCCI that we might talk about today. It's beautiful and sort of hints at the complexities of living and working in Central India as a human or non-human entity. And this talk is primarily going to talk about these shared spaces outside of protected areas and how people live in these shared spaces within conservation landscapes. Central India is very human dominated, and that's sort of like the backdrop of all of my work as well. So thank you for inviting me to give this talk, and I'm just going to go into it. So I'm going to start off by sort of the reasoning of why we're doing this kind of applicable work, and it's sort of crystallized in our vision, which we've put out, and the vision has changed. This is the 10th year of the NCCI, the Network for Conserving Central India, network that was started in the second year of my PhD. So we're fairly new, but also we're fairly deeply embedded in Central India. And the idea was always to sort of not do conservation or development work in isolation. We found that it was not useful for applicable science to only look at conservation from a wildlife perspective, or for development work in these landscapes to specifically only look from a economic income kind of perspective, which was happening a lot. And that's how this vision was sort of crystallized of this Jugalbandi. And that sort of belies who's doing this work as well, right? Jugalbandi may not be what everyone on the ground is calling it, but it's something that we feel sort of captures the work that we're doing. And here we are outsiders in a large degree to Central India itself, but our network really has many people who live and work and have dedicated their lives to make things better in Central India from the previous how many ever years they've inhabited them. And so going from this sort of background vision, I'm going to sort of split this talk into four major parts. The first is the biocultural context for coexistence in Central India. I'm going to talk a bit anecdotally about the things that I've noticed, and also some stories from recent travels across Central India. I'm then going to talk about how we're working towards creating a safe passage for wildlife in human-dominated spaces between protected areas in Central India. the science behind it for a little bit, as well as also the outreach, public engagement work that we're doing now. And also then sort of just going from that vision, speaking about what it means to make a life in a tiger conservation landscape in central India, and sort of the work that we're doing engaged in that space. How we're reaching out across divides that are academic, field-based or industry-based, to ensure that we're asking the questions that make sense for applicable science to help people's lives in central India. And over all of this and over like the last few years, my journey sort of asked questions of myself in saying, who's asking this question? If it's a research question, are they the right person to be asking this question? I also speak English and Hindi, but I'm going to stick to English for this talk. But in the Q&A, if people want to jump into Hindi and they feel more comfortable in Hindi, I think we might be able to do that. And the hosts can help with how we're going to present the Q&A for that. But if I slip into Hindi, someone please make a noise and say switch back to English. Thank you. So just jumping into the biocultural context of central India, we think of central India as this space from the wildlife conservation side where this deification of the tiger happens. And the tiger is one of the big wildlife charismatic species in central India. It's not the only one. There's elephants, there's other big cats, there's pangolins, there's otters, and there's migratory birds, there's vultures, all sorts. But primarily, a lot of the work that I have been doing is centered around the tiger as this charismatic species, often called umbrella species, and in the way that it functions across the ecosystem. And we initially think of the biocultural context for coexistence as this deification of wildlife. So this is just a picture to consider that that's one aspect that does exist in central India. Another thing to consider is sort of the Jugalbandi. How far back does it go? Like humans and wild animals have shared these spaces, and is it this sort of nod in our work to all of that came before, and the sort of feeling that we must document these aspects of shared living, and so the work should help to keep that in place. And should also come from the ground up, the people who have these relationships in place in central India. Is that sort of like the motivation to do the work that we do from conservation? Or is it sort of to retain these cultural aspects of central India? This is a picture of rock paintings from somewhere in Bastar when I was traveling last monsoon. The only trip I've made to Bastar, and if you haven't been, you really should go. It's a beautiful place. Is it this sort of everyday inclusion of wildlife in life and death? These are again sort of tombs or funeral setups from Bastar again, where everyone's circumstance, social stature, everything is reflected even in death. And you can see that this particular uncle might have been, someone who really walked around the village a lot, had the stick. And so you don't know these stories, but there are artifacts of these lives. And tigers do make a sort of presence felt there as well. Now, I have no idea if this was a conflict case or if this just was someone whose field was frequented by a tiger in monsoon. I have no idea why the tiger is there, but the tiger is very much still there. And just like these, is it as common as sort of the work that we're doing? Is it to do with people's everyday lives? And I really find more resonance in that. To try, it's also my training, right? So I'm more trained to count things, do statistics, walk transects, compared to sit down and really soak in people's beliefs. And from that training comes this bent of mine to do more work that is asking the question of what is happening now? What are they dealing with now? Is this part of their life now? So is that the kind of work that is most relevant? It certainly is part of the biocultural setup in central India. Is it Mahua? Mahua sort of ties central India together in some ways. You can see that there are these stills across villages, and if you come across the still or if you come across central India in Mahua season, it is undeniable how pervasive the smell of mahua flowers is across the forests of central India. It's also one of the big economic draws of the forests of central India. Is it Tendu? Is it the kind of work we should be doing it on NTFPs, which are non-timber forest produce? There is a large reliance on non-timber forest produce in central India. It's an integral part of people's lives. It's part of their social calendars. It's part of how they've always lived. And the different ways in which control is exerted on these resources is a huge part of the considerations of the work we're doing. Whether it's tiger connectivity or whether it's people's livelihoods. These are the forests that also provide income for people. And is it places like this compared to more peri-urban places? I have to tell you that I inhabit a lot less green and a lot more developed spaces in central India. This again is a picture from Bastar, and it's sort of a placeholder for me to tell you a few anecdotal stories of what I took back from my trip there. So this is a picture of a gotul, but it's not a real gotul. This is a gotul sort of explanation. And a gotul was basically this place. It's been called different things. It's been called the children's governance system, or it's called the space, the creche for villages in Bastar. But the gotul is the central sort of dormitory area where all the children of the villages would come and live. And so like your village rules and your village songs and your village governance was sort of hosted at the gotul. And a lot of times decisions would be made at the gotul. So it's almost like if you want to think about ground up, it really doesn't get more ground up than saying the children of the village are part of every decision, every way of thinking, retaining culture, discussing culture, changing a song, changing a particular say a particular rite or ritual. Now, I don't know how much agency they had to change things, but they were certainly part of governance at the village. And it was at the Gotul that a lot of festivals would kick off. People would learn how to officially propose to your hopeful spouse, and how to take rejection when that happened. And there's loads of stories of how Gotuls function. And I thought it was a really interesting way to consider how an alternate way of education might have existed compared to what's happening in the villages in central India now, where there's the primary schooling, the secondary schooling, and children. There are not many, if any, gotuls anymore. And so this is a lost part of this biocultural heritage of an alternate way of life, perhaps. And or it makes you consider what are the alternates starting from childhood, then going to a primary school where your teacher may or may not come, or you may not have access to in monsoon, compared to being part of your village and being part of education in a different way, which was more skill-based, which was more lore-based, and more societal rules-based. So this is just a placeholder for that. This is another anecdote of like how the different peoples in central India lived alongside each other, and in some of the denser forests, maybe didn't really come across each other while they were inhabiting the same spaces. So Buddhism came through central India and inhabits pockets still, but this is a leftover relic of a Buddha statue. And because it's near the bend of a river, when people saw it, when tribal people or Adivasi people came across it, they didn't know who had made it. And they hadn't met the people who had made these statues, but they knew that it was something to care for. It was sort of this instinctive feeling that this is something of relevance. This is someone has painstakingly made this. It must mean something. And so this particular statue is just called Dokra Baba statue, which sort of just means like the Baba at the bend of the river, with no real, mixing of cultures, but just the overarching layers. And that really speaks to how I've found Central India as well. Like I'll come across something, I won't understand it. I'll come back again, someone will tell me a story about it. I'll come back a third time, someone will find me a book about it, and then I'll try and get to the bottom of it, but I'm not always really sure what actually happened, but the layers seem really apparent. And so that's sort of what I can work with. I also thought it was really cute that you come across something and you just instinctive feeling of this is something to retain, this is something to consider, and also maintain for the future, even if it's not yours. A different way of thinking, perhaps, to recreating or capturing resources. This is another story that I actually want to spend some time on. This is an Angadev. And the Angadev is here. They don't have form, these devs, but they have carriers, right? So this is like a chariot for this Angadev. And this is a temple. So this is where that Angadev is. And they're like ancestral sort of guardians of one village or a couple of villages. And there was this beautiful story where it talks about accountability. And I found myself at the right place at the right time to think about this, because I was thinking of all the different ways governance doesn't work and all the different ways it lets us down because of the way it's structured in silos and the lack of accountability. And here was this example of village sort of governance where even gods were accountable. So the Angadev is ancestral god or the caretaker of your village, and through a medium and through stories and through requests at specific times, you can communicate with the Angdev and they can suggest things. But the more interesting thing is every Angdev for miles comes to Bangaram, where there is the Devi, and this Devi actually holds court. So on Dashera, from different villages, people carry their Angdev on those chariots with maybe a symbol, but there's no actual deity form. So these are all symbols of who came along with the deity. These are not the deities. But like this Angdev has been discarded. You can see that it's just a rubbish heap. And this is on sort of where the shot has been taken. I'm facing away from the rubbish heap on my left-hand side. So this area here, you can sort of start to see it. This temple complex is where this court is held. And so say you had a drought and you spoke to your ancestral god and they said, if you wait to sow this year, or if you wait to sow more millets and less rice this year, or you say, sacrifice 2 goats, whatever was the information given to you by your god, you did that and the drought continued and nothing changed and you faced losses. Or someone did a crime and the punishment seemed too little and the criminal continues to live in your village. You bring your Angadev here on the Adivasi Dashera and you complain to the Devi, saying, our God did nothing. We did what he asked, but we need to hold him accountable. And over here are spiritual jails. So through a medium, the Angdev's response, the Devi's response to the Angdev's complaints are brought back out and meted out to everybody. And so here is where some gods have been for a decade. They've been in spiritual jail. Whereas if you've been a really unaccountable god, you get discarded. And then a new ancestral god is instated for your village. Or you can seek back one of these in some manner of permutation combination of how you do it. But here was an example that from the village, even gods were accountable, which I thought was a beautiful thing to take back from my time in Bastar. And that sort of brings me to the next part. So there's all of these stories, there's all this lore, there's all this lived history. It's being corporatized, it's being made commercial. I went as a tourist to see much of Bastar, but it still exists. And that to me is incredible given how Central India changed. And Central India has changed for the wildlife as well, right? Wildlife has to move from one protected area to another. It inhabits a lot of the spaces in between. And those spaces have changed much faster than what we have in protected areas. So I'm now going to get into how we are working on safe passage for wildlife, given that biocultural background to the kind of place Central India is. And so in central India, largely there are various definitions, but we largely use MP, parts of Vidarbha in Maharashtra, and some parts of Chhattisgarh. If you are going to do work that is in Orissa or spans from Orissa almost all the way to Gujarat, there are reasons to do that. Ecological bounds are, how they wouldn't, for each study that we do, this boundary could change. But this is the sort of working boundary of the area of work for the NCCI. And of course, this has over 20% of the global tiger population. But this slide for me, honestly, is also a slide to say, how did we get here? There were forced evictions of people from these green polygons, which are now tiger reserves. These have been hard-won spaces for tigers in violate of humans for the most part now. But that's an active external management that has brought us here. And it has ramifications for how people live in the middle and how animals can get safe passage in the middle. And I would like us to keep that in mind. It's very peopled. These are village boundaries in the gray. And this is from a consensus study that the NCCI led, trying to figure out what might be the most crucial corridors across the space for tigers. And basically what we did was we took 5 different existing tiger connectivity studies, took their data and sandwiched them to see what was in agreement, what was in consensus scientifically. So all the dark blue and pink is sort of that consensus connectivity areas layer that is now published and can be used by managers how they like. This is not the bounds of the corridor. These are the most likely routes that tigers will take across this landscape. Now, there are a few scientific things we could discuss here. One is, do we know how tigers use agriculture? We don't really know how well, we don't know that well. So a lot of this is modeling forest cover in central India. And so that is one limitation of the study, and suggests that there should be more work in shared spaces about how big cats are using the agricultural matrix to get from one part to another. But this is the latest step in that work. And so all the pink that you're seeing in here is village land. So you'll get some forest development corporation land, you'll get some sort of reserve forest, but you'll also get all of these villages within the areas that tigers are most likely to use to get from one park to another. So it's really peopled. All of this gray polygons is people. And it's not just people in their houses, right? It's how many times roads cross over these corridors and rails cross over these corridors. Sort of going back to that first picture on the title slide about how a tiger might have to navigate across all of central India. Just heaps of infrastructure, lots of people, and continuing dispersal in spite of all this from one protected area to another. So it really makes this urgent case for trying to understand these shared spaces. And it makes this urgent case for trying to mitigate the worst impacts for animal movement across these spaces. Now, a few of you might be here who know this area really well and know these spaces really well. I know for a fact researchers have recently been talking about how other species use these corridor areas or connectivity areas. We also know a bunch of our own partners who've been working with us to figure out what is the easiest way to mitigate some of this development of linear infrastructure that's coming through central India. And so that brings me to making a life in these shared spaces as well. And we can talk a bit more about the science. Please ask me questions at the end of this. I can talk a bit more about what we're doing with public engagement further in the talk. But in all of these shared spaces, like I told you, there are people who are farming, people who are looking for jobs, people whose employment rates are low, people who have found their ways of life changed by external forces, just like external forces have shaped how wildlife can and cannot get across these spaces. And so it brings this question that is the sort of central question to the kind of work we do in terms of the livelihoods, the work that we do. We try and be really mindful about asking the stakeholders or the actors what their visions for the future are before we jump in and say this might be great for you to do. And so it asks these questions. Who's asking for coexistence? And who is asked to coexist? And it talks about that entire history that I was telling you about, where externally people have come and said, this is now a national park. You may no longer live here. You may no longer hunt. If animals come and raid your farms, you may or may not be compensated for that given your location. And this to a whole bunch of peoples who always lived there. So it's about these power dynamics and these conflicts. And the conflicts are perhaps not always between a dangerous wild animal and humans, but also between different humans socially, economically in the same space. And nothing is more sort of signaling this than the increase of conflict around Tadoba, Chandrapur, where conflict is just increasing as we continue to prioritize tigers that are dispersing out of small protected areas that are and don't have safe passage to get to the other place or cannot do it without causing harm to people. And also, all of this also walks us back to my thesis work, which was on resettlement around Kanha. This is during monsoon surveys when I was conducting them. And a few things that really shaped how I think about the work that I would do in Central India came from my thesis. One was the fact that when I looked at where resettled people went and how their lives were once they had left the park compared to their neighbors. So it wasn't a before after, it was more what do you do now? You got a bunch of compensation, you moved to this new place, was there enough hand holding? What are your lives like now? And for that, I sort of used two very quantitative metrics. This is me learning my way of how to do this kind of work as well. And so I looked at food security as a metric of well-being, and I used very coarse sort of measurements to look at what kind of coping mechanisms do people use if they don't have enough food? Are they eating enough food groups with enough frequency? I also looked at people's sort of income sources and how they were managing to survive at the new place, and also their forest use. Because the rationale to have them move in the first place was to make sure that these spaces existed for wildlife within protected areas, and that once you were out, you didn't have as much pressure on the forest. What I found, which would seem very obvious to those of you who know Central India, is that they just joined a whole bunch of villages outside, right? So if you moved 800 people, they joined 5,000 villages on the outside. So it's not that their pressures were inordinately more, not in terms of household quantum anyways. They were comparable to their neighbors in almost every way. So the more scary part was that everyone around Kanha was very poor, had bad food security, whether you were resettled or not, and continued to use the forests for grazing, for tendu, for mahua, for any other kind of commercial gain. And that's the reality of a lot of these Central Indian landscapes. It's almost as if conservation has made sure that if you live within these landscapes, you have very few livelihood opportunities, because a lot of development like mining and setting up large factories will be dissuaded. You will have high incidence of food insecurity because you may not be able to get to markets on time, you won't have access to forests the same ways, and you're being only able to grow things that are being munched on by cheetal and other ungulates coming out of the forests, if not your own cattle going from one to another. So this was the sort of setup in which to ask questions about conservation. And I found myself thinking, if we can't ask people about conservation unless we ask people about what their vision for their lives are going to be. And so that sort of changed how I even ask a conservation question, right? So if we say we want to reduce grazing pressure, then perhaps that question has to start with, okay, but then what are people going to do if they're not grazing their cattle? And so that's how I started thinking about these things. And it brought me back to that idea that is this coexistence brokered on better lives that are authentically driven by what people want from the forests and their vision for the landscape, not our vision, their vision of the landscape. And it is about having plentiful mahua, about being able to collect tendu when they need to, but tendu is more commercial. So the mahua seems more integral, but the Tendu seems more commercial. And maybe it's a mix of both these things. And that's how we should consider livelihoods, as a basket of options that has always existed for people, and seasonally what they can sub in and out of. Another result from my thesis was that around Kanha, at least, a lot of people will change the forms of capital they have to financial capital because that's their reality. They live in extremely market dependent ways. And therefore, if they have social capital to work on each other's farms, they will convert that to money or try to convert that to money. If they have natural capital from the forests, they will try and commercialize it. It's very economically driven in terms of how the lives have changed around Kanha. In other parts of central India, I don't see that signature as much. And that brings me to a point of all of our work needs to be very set up in where we're trying to do. So what works around Kanha will not work around Panna. This is within central India. This is not saying central India's results will not work in Himachal. This is saying central India's works will not work from one park's landscape to the other. And so we have to be really mindful of that as we do applicable science. And so it sort of all of this fed into the work of the NCCI, right? We asked ourselves these hard questions that maybe we weren't qualified to even answer, or at least keep in mind as we navigated the next piece of science that felt realistically useful for us and the people we've been speaking to within the network. The network itself is made of NGOs, researchers, some government people have engaged with us on and off, and we found it really hard ourselves to include communities. And over the course of the last 10 years, we've tried really hard to have conversations with people who were resettled, to include farmer producer organizations and their directors in our conversations, to include NGOs who we weren't traditionally speaking to, but we really should have been, who did a lot of livelihood and farming work in central India. So NCCI is now at this point where we're really trying to foster these bottom-up approaches in a very top-down world in central India by using science and applicable science results. And one of the big things that I think NCCI does well is give sustained small grants. And these are people who've dedicated their lives to doing what they do in place-based settings. So a lot of folks are very knowledgeable on the ground and really strapped for funds and are in this cycle where every year the NGO mandate might change because funding changes or your research question changes because the funding has sort of changed. We try and provide a sandwich for that by providing sustained funds for 2 or 3 times to the same person saying, this is the work that you're doing and you should do it. And we have these conversations back and forth. So one of the things that NCCI has been doing is putting out these small grants. And these small grants have led to really interesting discussions we wouldn't have had otherwise. Discussions about seed monopoly, discussions about conflict and whether we should be spending time on carnivore conflict compared to crop raiding, which is causes far more economic losses, although the carnivore conflict is far more dire and immediately horrible. But these are the kind of conversations that are brought from the network to discuss what's the next priority. And it's because there's this sustained cycle of funding. Please do check out their projects. They're really cool projects. They're long-standing work, and check them out on the website. And it also brings up things like our livelihoods work, right? So the work that we do with livelihoods is in a way that the network doesn't set the priorities as much as the people the network is working with sets the priorities. So a lot of NGOs within the NCCI work with farming communities around Kanha. This work is specifically around Kanha. And they find themselves in a space where while they can do the work, they don't know how effective they're being as NGOs. And so the NCCI can be part of that and help to measure effectiveness of NGO engagements and then see whether the lives are actually getting better. So it's sort of like monitoring and evaluation, but we'd like it to be far more than that in terms of this particular effort around millets, around Kanha. In only a year, we've set up a roundtable of a bunch of NGOs that go from Pradhan, who's sort of national level, to really small in place like CDC, that's Amin's outfit, community development, or even Samarth, who's sort of more local over here, and Vasan. And the idea has been that millets that have been part of the cultural farming system may be drought tolerant, and that might be really useful for farmers as they build out resilience in climate change impacts. And while we don't think this is a silver bullet, it goes back to that idea of providing a livelihood basket that is authentic, that comes from the place where it always existed and can be modernized, can be changed, can be tweaked as per the people who are doing the farming. And those people get a say in what's the next bit of science they need. And so this round table within a year has brought up priorities that we didn't really have on our radar, neither did the NGOs we were working with. NGOs were looking at market linkages, NGOs were looking at saleability of varieties. Whereas when we started having these discussions, we talked about seed availability for the farmer. We talked about where are the local seed banks, and maybe varietal purity is not important to those consuming these millets within the landscapes. It really brought a lens of what lives of people in these landscapes are like and what they need for the next few years. Do they need insurances? Do they need better tech? Do they need to understand their traditional farming calendars and adapt them to changing monsoons? Because a lot of them have used lands, that sloping lands where you can grow kodo and kutki, the two millets that are grown in this landscape. They've used those sloping lands, brought in a JCB and converted it to paddy because it's subsidized to make the bunds for paddy. But paddy has been having losses over years because of uncertain monsoons. And how does this link back to the conservation work I was talking about before? It's sort of that piece where unless people are in charge of their lives, they're not going to be interested or available to talk about what has now become the forest department's wildlife. How is it of any relevance to them how a tiger goes from one place to another as the erosion of the deification of the tiger happens, as goatals disappear, and you go to primary school and you learn about how you should be as compared, as told to you by an urban person versus how you know you have been or your ancestors have been. When you had accountability of gods and now you live in a system where you can't even hold your panchayat accountable. In that setup, how can you talk about tiger conservation without addressing farmers' incomes on a yearly basis or the options they have for livelihoods? So that's the core of this millets work. This millets work is planned for the next 5 years. We don't have results yet. It's year one. We're just crunching the data. We have a few ideas. The big ones are local processing. It really changed our thinking from getting these millets to urban consumers to really thinking about what all these millets do locally. So the local consumption, the local production, those have come to the fore a lot more. And I'm really happy to be part of this work because it really allows me to use that evolution of my 10 years in Central India to ask the questions in the way we are. And that brings us to this public engagement piece, right? Bagchal. We've done this with a bunch of collaborators, and as a network, all of this work has been collaborative. So a big thank you to people who've really, found time above and beyond their regular jobs to do some of this together with us. Bagchal is this campaign to look at connectivity in shared spaces using that consensus tiger areas, connectivity areas paper, and making it more useful to more people who do connectivity work in Central India. So this beautiful poster is by Sudarshan Shaw. Like I said, it makes these beautiful panels and the challenges of how you live in Central India quite apparent. Like all of our conversations, people and infrastructure and tigers and all of these thin little spaces to get from one place to another sort of are exemplified on here. This is a poster. If you wanted it, you could download it off as a public engagement tool. This was done with Biodiversity Collaborative. And of course, a few people from the NCCI who really subbed in. We took that paper and we made it into this infographic so that we could, really get at the heart of the pieces. People can use this on the ground. Different NGOs can do it. We've got this converted in Hindi and Marathi. So you can just get it off the you can download it off the website and then use it wherever you are. In fact, we kind of road tested a bit of this in the last collaborative workshop we do. So we're doing these collaborative workshops with the Coalition for Wildlife Corridors, another outfit you should check out. And this was being road tested there. And then this is the video sort of explainer of this connectivity piece. And I'd like to play this and open us up for questions after. This is this is also available in Hindi on the webpage. And finally, this sort of DIY kit of use this study and the tools of public engagement. One of them is a customizable info card for your region of interest as a smaller inset for the connectivity areas in central India. Someone please let me know if the videos audio doesn't reach you.
There's something fundamental to all life on Earth, the need to move between and across spaces for food, work, and sometimes just to find a new home. Some movements, by their very nature, are beyond man made borders. Deep in the heart of India, where forests, rivers, and people thrive together, lives the national animal, the tiger. The vast central Indian landscape houses one of the largest populations of wild tigers on Earth. For generations, people have shared this land with this big cat. Today, tiger numbers are on the rise, but there's more to the story than just numbers. Scientists believe for healthy populations to thrive, there needs to be an exchange of genetic material, which is only possible when tigers move across. In fact, 35% of India's tiger range is outside protected areas. This connection of life across the landscape is what ecologists call connectivity. Today, it's under threat due to ways in which land has undergone changes, often leading to tragedies for people as well as the tigers. Somewhere between all of this, we have lost an important connection. Connecting habitats require connecting people. Can we find ways that don't privilege movement for some over others? In the heart of India, something important is unfolding, an effort to reconnect what's being lost. There's something
Yep. Thank you, everyone. And I know we have some time for questions. I can stop sharing the screen as well.
Thanks, Amita. Thanks for a lovely presentation. Please put the questions in your chat if anyone has any. Or yeah, Amita, do you want me to read the question? Would you?
Either ways is fine. Yeah.
Okay. So I'll just read it out. Central India seems to present a very varied mix with respect to implementation of the FRA. Places like Kandachuri and parts of Chandigarh seems to have done well. But at the same time, one also sees a place like Satpura TR where hundreds of families, including from ST, seem to have moved without the slightest effort to implement the FRA, even asking some of them to forsake the FRA benefits. To what extent can and does the FRA enable help the Pakchal? This is by Madhusudan.
Yeah, thank you for that great question. The FRA and the resettlement have really, it's like walking into two different landscapes when you discuss the FRA. Sometimes you're in a landscape where really I've spoken to the people who did some of the Satpura resettlement, and depending on who you speak to, they will say it's done well or it's done badly. But the way FRA really helps Bagchal is clarify that these are shared spaces, A. Two, once they have rights in the areas within that are connectivity areas, it really creates impetus to do science that's required to manage shared spaces as shared spaces. The danger really for me is when connectivity areas are considered as protective areas, sort of like make this the channel for tigers to get from one point to the other. That's not even how tigers function. So the FRA helps Bagchal in clarifying that these are not bridges. These are not, channels for animals to go one place to another. It's a different setup. It's a different way of management. And it really has to be bottom up in these areas that are very peopled, where people have rights. That's not an exact way the FRA will be used for Bagchal, but it's the way where we at least have the framing for it. And I'd love to chat with you more about this if there's interest, or especially if there's outfits working on FRA in these sort of consensus connectivity areas that you know of that we should tap into. Thanks, Madhu.
We have another question by Vaishnavi. I'm a data science and spatial analytics student. I am writing a research paper on effects of linear. Sorry, I think.
Yeah.
I think I just lost that chart. Yeah.
That's okay. I got it. So this is about the effect of linear development on tigers in central India. What kind of analysis can I do for the same which contributes to conservation, and which region in central India should I focus on? Okay, so you saw that map where literally linear infrastructure is crawling all over central India. A lot of forest diversion takes place for linear infrastructure. In fact, one of the things that we're really mindful of is, does this linear infrastructure serve the local population, or does it serve very far away urban centers? And therefore, what should be the way to really plan for these? The other thing that to consider over here really is that when you have linear infrastructure, the thing that you have to pay attention to is sort of more advocacy. But in terms of writing a research paper, perhaps one of the things you could do is to look at the data. So there's Parivesh data that looks at the amount of diversions that are coming for forest clearance for linear infrastructure in central India. That's a data piece to really get into. The other space to get into for spatial analytics is really to update some of this, because already the India under construction layers are very out of date. There's been heaps more that's come through. And if you want to get into sort of like the modalities of linear infrastructure, there's interesting things to do in terms of how many mitigation structures have existed where, what mitigation structures are working. So sort of matching the sort of impact of mitigation structures for wildlife passage in linear infrastructure with the amount of infrastructure that's coming in. We can have a side chat about this. Please do write to us. You can write directly to me, but also you could write to the coordinator of the network, and they can put you in touch with other researchers working on this. Thanks, Vaishnavi, for that question. And thanks, Madhu. I will definitely be in touch.
We have another question by Titi. Do you think there's a possibility to include the deep knowledge of cultural and spiritual lifestyle of tribal people into main science stream, especially in conservation sciences?
Right. Huge question. Thanks, Titi. And it's what we're all trying to do. But we're probably going to do it badly multiple times over before we get any of it right. And that's also speaking to our own training, our own limitations in ways of seeing and knowing the world. But one of the things I would like to say is, at the NCCI at least, or in my work at least, what I try and do is ask the question that people want asked, right? So if I think it's really important, like I was just saying, see the quantum of impact of mitigation done compared to the quantum of linear infrastructure, perhaps in shared spaces, I should take that question to the communities themselves and say, is this the relevant question? And in terms of deep knowledge, it depends on what. A lot of traditional knowledge of what plants were being used for in these villages is being completely lost. No one in the new generation really even wants to know, right? They have different aspirations. They live in a world where those aspirations are sort of, they are all of our aspirations. Everyone's trying to live a better quality of life as defined by someone else. So that kind of deep knowledge, to bring it back into conservation sciences or sciences mainstream, means all of us as researchers need to really acknowledge that the ways in which we do science might not benefit those that we're doing the science for. And this works both ways. If you do if you ask the question for wildlife conservation in a way that is very commercially favorable, you're actually helping the stakeholders trying to continue to exploit resources versus the wildlife that you're setting out to help. Similarly, if you set out to do agriculture in what we were thinking, like market linkages, big urban setups, but all of that broke down because we spoke to people and their knowledge of farming really reoriented their entire conversation. So I think if there is a possibility to do so, it's much harder. It means that you have to be okay with doing a bad job of it and learning along the way and have people teach you. I hope that's an engagement with your question. I'm not sure I answered it. There's another one from Ravi. Anjali, should I just go over here? Okay. The Forest Governance and Livelihoods Group at AD does a lot of work on FRA. Yeah. Definitely will connect with them, Ravi. I was speaking to Venkat a lot when he was doing his PhD because on the NTFP work. And so, like I said, there's so many people to thank for the work that we do at NCCI. I am definitely not going to get everyone's logos and everyone's name onto these slides, but they are well represented in the publications and on the website. So please do go check all of this work out on the website as well. Happy to talk more with you, Ravi, as well about that engagement to take it further. Anything else?
Yeah, I'll just read it out, Amrita.
Sure.
Vinay says, you talked about helping locals to grow millet crops to have multiple income channels. You said it is yet to be understood how the tiger interacts in agricultural lands, but other herbivores are definitely a trouble in shared agricultural spaces. How is it there?
Yeah, so the way it is we know tigers use agricultural lands to also get across from one place to another. They don't just use forest. But the idea is there's multiple threads here. If you have sugarcane, that's great cover. A tiger is a cat. It understands this. It's going to use larger, more homogenic spaces that have cover to get from one point to another. The traditional homestead in around Kanha, at least, had some sloping land where they would grow millets in the village. Maybe someone had more of those sloping lands than others. Some people had some paddy, and some people had some other vegetables that were growing behind their houses. Now, in this setup, if there's a bad rain year, not all of your fields get totaled. If it's ungulates are coming to eat your crops, you can guard your crop that is going to be harvested, and there's a harvest cycle, and there are smaller fields, so you're able to do it better. But if you change all that to large paddy farming or large sugarcane farming, you don't know how the tiger's going to navigate that, but you certainly know that the ungulates are coming to eat. So that's how it is there, but I'm happy to feel free to jump in here and ask me other things about this question because I'm not sure I answered that.
Vinay, do you want to unmute yourself if you have any more questions around it? Okay, I guess not, but Seema has a question in the chat.
Okay.
She asks, are these landscapes only used as tiger corridors, or is it a tiger habitat now?
Right, interesting. So we're calling them consensus connectivity areas for this sort of separation. A lot of these habitats have resident tigers, what we previously used to call settings. There are all the modalities of connectivity habitats in here. So there's the stepping stones setup, there's the linear corridor setup, there's this large, multiple spatially heterogeneous areas between two protected areas. So we're calling them consensus connectivity areas because A, there is consensus across the data sets that these are important. B, they do form connectivity channels from one place to another. But really, we're not defining these as specific corridors because there are resident populations. Yeah, and resident populations in shared spaces need different management than resident populations of tigers in protected areas. So that's the upcoming challenge.
Get back to you with the other questions.
Sure.
Uh,
And Vinay, feel free to email me and we can chat more.
Okay. Ravi has put up, courts have been ruling, especially on elephant corridors. Often this ends up affecting local communities. Has this risk been recognized, and what are the plans to deal with it?
Right. And Ravi, that's actually that splits the room in NCCI. Because what happens is there are different partners within the NCCI, some more protectionist bent of mind, more wildlife um, prioritizing bent of mind, and others who are more like these have always been shared spaces. Please don't create the same folly of managing them as protected areas. Courts have been ruling mostly the courts are ruling on the linear infrastructure stuff that I've come across in central India and some of the FRA stuff, but it does affect local communities. The risk has been recognized, but what are we doing with it? We don't yet know. Part of the public engagement, and thank you for bringing this up because you're part of the public engagement as Biodiversity Collaborative for this. But what we're doing with those tools is we're taking it to the other collaboratives we're part of, like the Coalition for Wildlife Corridors that's doing national work, but specifically in central India, this is how we're doing it. We're taking all of this science, making it more applicable, more useful with you as the Bagchal campaign, taking the Bagchal campaign to workshops with the forest department, other line agencies, potentially training EIA professionals, and also taking it to people in different languages so that this information is all out there and we can collectively be like, is the risk of courts ruling on corridors as protected areas recognized? Is the risk of courts ruling in these areas as purely revenue lands recognized? What should we do in these areas with this information now as smaller collaboratives in specific shared spaces? I'm not sure that's where you were going with this, but happy to chat more on a sidebar as well.
Uh, we're right on time. Is there any other questions? Or I think we can close the session.
Okay, thank you all.
Um, Thanks, Amrita. Thanks for a lovely presentation. And
Yeah,
thank you. Solid.
we have one more question, but we can, Srinidhi, can you email me? I think we're closing up.
You can, if it's okay with you, Amrita, we can wrap this up.
Oh, yeah. So the short answer is they don't really get to. The long answer is we're really trying to include local people to participate in the conservation of tigers, especially in corridors, by first speaking to them about their lives and their visions. And a lot of times that ends up being we need better income. So we have to first talk about incomes and sustainable existence of people in these landscapes that have historically, stripped them of a lot of agency, taken away a lot of their resources, or at least gatekeeped a lot of their resources, and then ask the question of how do you see the conservation, or, I'll ask that in the larger view of their vision. They're not really active agents yet unless they're doing hard-won advocacy on the ground for their lands. Like Hasdeo is one example. You can go check it out online. It's this huge campaign where people really fought for their tribal Adivasi lands and their forests and didn't allow mining in. That kind of advocacy, which is really, really fraught with conflict and fraught with politics, does exist, and local communities participate in that way. But sort of the ground up everyday thinking of living in a wildlife landscape, that is not a reality that I've come across around Kanha quite as often. Okay.
Thanks again, Amrita. That was great. And thanks everyone for being an amazing audience and being part of this discussion. Just a bit of information on us. We do a monthly series where we have speakers who are invited on Coexistence coming to talk to us. Please follow. I have put in the chat the details of the consortium. So please follow our socials to know who's the next speaker. And also please feel free to, I'm sure that Amrita's talk had started a lot of questions. So please feel free to reach out and I can put you in touch with Amrita. Yeah, thank you again. Thanks again, Amrita.
Thanks. Bye all.